think you guys didn't like each other.
Besides him being a complete ass.
John McEnroe didn't just hate losing, he hated certain players. Not always because they beat him though, that didn't help, but because of how they played, how they behaved, or what they represented on a tennis court. Some rivalries in tennis are built on mutual respect. These weren't. These were the players who genuinely got under McEnroe's skin, and the tension was very real. Jimmy Connors wasn't just McEnroe's rival, he was his mirror image from a completely different world. McEnroe was the bratty New York artist, soft hands, serve and volley genius, tantrums that made headlines. Connors was the working-class scrapper from Illinois who turned tennis matches into street fights. They both had massive egos, they both fed off confrontation, and they absolutely could not stand each other during their peak years. Throughout the early 1980s, their rivalry felt personal. McEnroe represented the elegant future of tennis, creative, attacking, expressive. Connors was the relentless old guard, grinding from the baseline, screaming at crowds, pumping his fist like a boxer after every big point. Wimbledon 1984 brought everything to a boil. They met in the quarterfinals, with McEnroe playing the best tennis of his life. He won in straight sets, but the atmosphere was toxic. Every stare, every point, every changeover felt like a grudge match. The dislike was mutual and unmistakable. What truly bothered McEnroe was Connors' refusal to admire his artistry. To Connors, tennis was war. Beauty didn't matter, winning did. Connors was perfectly happy winning ugly, and that infuriated McEnroe, who desperately wanted his genius recognized. Their contrasting personalities extended beyond the court. McEnroe mingled with rock stars and artists in Manhattan. Connors hung with gamblers and hustlers. When they crossed paths at tournaments, the tension was palpable. Other players noticed, locker rooms went quiet. The head-to-head record tells part of the story. McEnroe led 20-14 overall, but numbers don't capture the intensity. Every match felt like a statement. Every victory felt personal. Years later, both men admitted they pushed each other to greatness. But at the time, respect was buried under pure animosity. If Connors frustrated McEnroe, Ivan Lendl broke him. Lendl was everything McEnroe despised in a tennis player: cold, mechanical, emotionless. He didn't rant, didn't rage, didn't perform. He just crushed opponents with relentless baseline pressure and physical discipline. The 1984 French Open final remains the most painful match of McEnroe's career. He entered riding an incredible winning streak, dominating the sport. He won the first 2 sets easily. Lendl looked overwhelmed. McEnroe was 2 sets away from completing a career Grand Slam. Then everything unraveled. Lendl didn't panic. He didn't change personality. He simply stayed patient, increased the physical demands, and waited. McEnroe, meanwhile, grew frustrated. Volleys missed, tempers flared, control slipped away. Lendl won the next 3 sets and the championship. McEnroe never recovered from it and never won the French Open. What made it worse was Lendl's approach to tennis itself. He trained like a machine, ate like a scientist, and treated the sport like an engineering problem. No flair, no emotion, just efficiency. To McEnroe, it felt soulless. The contrast was stark in every detail. While McEnroe arrived at tournaments last minute, Lendl planned weeks in advance. While McEnroe played by feel, Lendl studied patterns and percentages. While McEnroe saw inspiration, Lendl relied on preparation. Their 1985 US Open final deepened the wound. McEnroe had won the title the previous year. Lendl dismantled him in straight sets on his home court. The New York crowd couldn't save him. Lendl's consistency was suffocating. McEnroe later admitted Lendl got into his head. Losing wasn't the worst part. Losing to someone who embodied everything he feared tennis was becoming was. Fitness over finesse, power over creativity. Lendl represented the future, and McEnroe hated it. The rivalry finished 21-15 in Lendl's favor. More importantly, Lendl proved tennis was evolving beyond the serve and volley era. McEnroe dominated. That realization haunted him. If Lendl was a machine, Mats Wilander was a wall. Wilander didn't overwhelm opponents, he suffocated them. Long rallies, patient defense, smart shot selection. On clay, he was especially brutal. For McEnroe, the ultimate serve and volley artist who wanted quick points and creative finishes, playing Wilander felt like torture. Whenever they met on clay during the mid-1980s, the story was usually the same. Wilander dragged McEnroe into extended baseline exchanges, neutralized his net attacks, and forced him to play a style he hated. The 1984 French Open semi-final exemplified their contrast. Wilander made McEnroe work for every single point. No freebies, no rhythm, just grinding, methodical tennis that wore down McEnroe's patience and legs. Wilander won in 4 sets, and McEnroe looked miserable throughout. McEnroe never hid his disdain for that kind of tennis. He called it boring. He mocked baseline grinders who prioritize consistency over creativity. In interviews, he'd complain about matches that felt more like marathons than tennis. Wilander didn't care. He won 3 French Opens and multiple Grand Slams by playing exactly that way. The clash wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. McEnroe believed tennis should be bold, attacking, and entertaining. Wilander believed it should be smart, patient, and strategic. On clay especially, Wilander's philosophy often won, and that stung deeply. What made it worse was Wilander's demeanor. No trash talk, no drama, just quiet confidence and intelligent tennis. McEnroe couldn't even get angry at him properly. There was nothing to grab onto, no personality to clash with, just relentless competence. Years later, McEnroe softened his tone, acknowledging Wilander's intelligence. But during their battles, irritation ruled. Ilie Nastase should have been McEnroe's kindred spirit. Both were volatile. Both argued with umpires. Both pushed tennis etiquette to the breaking point. But instead of bonding over shared chaos, McEnroe couldn't stand him. Nastase was the original bad boy of tennis, infamous long before McEnroe arrived. He insulted opponents, mocked officials, clowned around, and crossed lines even McEnroe avoided. The difference, in McEnroe's mind, was intent. McEnroe believed his outbursts came from obsession with perfection. Nastase's felt theatrical chaos for entertainment's sake. McEnroe hated being compared to Nastase. The comparison felt insulting. Yes, both were rebels, but McEnroe wanted respect for his genius. Nastase seemed content being the villain. The media constantly drew parallels. The new Nastase, they called him early in his career. McEnroe bristled every time. He saw himself as an artist fighting for fairness. Nastase was a showman playing to the crowd. Ironically, Nastase paved the way for McEnroe by breaking tennis's stuffy country club culture first. Without him, McEnroe's behavior might never have been tolerated. But McEnroe never embraced that legacy. Instead, Nastase became an uncomfortable reflection of everything he feared becoming. Their reputations collided more than their careers. Nastase was past his prime when McEnroe emerged, and the contempt was unmistakable. When forced to interact at tournaments or exhibitions, the awkwardness was visible. No warmth, no camaraderie, just 2 rebels who couldn't stand each other. Brad Gilbert wasn't the most talented player McEnroe faced, but he may have been the most irritating. Gilbert built his career on a philosophy he later immortalized in the book, Winning Ugly. He didn't aim for beauty, he aimed for victory using moonballs, junk shots, slices, and psychological pressure to break opponents down. Against McEnroe, it worked. In several tour-level matches during the mid-1980s, Gilbert frustrated McEnroe with high-bouncing shots, long rallies, and constant disruption of rhythm. McEnroe's disgust was visible. This wasn't tennis as he believed it should be. It was mental warfare. The 1986 Masters tournament match between them was particularly grating. Gilbert used every trick in his arsenal lobbing when McEnroe rushed the net, slicing when he expected pace, changing speeds constantly. McEnroe won, but he looked furious doing it. The scoreline didn't reflect the irritation. McEnroe later criticized Gilbert's style as everything wrong with modern tennis, too calculated, too passive, too willing to sacrifice beauty for results. Gilbert didn't apologize. He embraced it. He turned weaknesses into weapons and wore opponents' frustration like a badge of honor. In press conferences, McEnroe would openly dismiss players like Gilbert, suggesting they succeeded despite lacking real talent. Gilbert fired back by continuing to win, eventually reaching number 4 in the world rankings. He proved ugly tennis was effective tennis. Gilbert didn't beat McEnroe because he was more talented. He beat him because he understood him, and McEnroe never forgave him for that. But the list doesn't end there. McEnroe's complicated relationship with Bjorn Borg deserves mention, though it was different from the others. Borg was his greatest rival. the man he battled in the most famous matches of that era. But unlike Connors, Lendl, or the others, McEnroe deeply respected Borg. What frustrated McEnroe about Borg wasn't his style or personality, it was his retirement. In 1983, at just 26 years old, Borg walked away from tennis at his peak. McEnroe felt abandoned. He'd finally figured out how to consistently challenge Borg, winning their last 3 matches. The rivalry was reaching new heights. Then it ended. McEnroe needed Borg. He pushed him to perfection. Without Borg, tennis felt emptier. McEnroe's famous 1984 season, 82 wins. 3 losses came after Borg retired. The dominance was there, but something was missing. The one opponent who truly understood and matched his intensity was gone. Years later, McEnroe admitted Borg's retirement affected him more than any loss ever did. It wasn't hate, it was loss. Then there was Michael Chang, though their friction came later in McEnroe's career. Chang represented everything McEnroe found frustrating about the next generation. Defense-first tennis, physical conditioning prioritized over shot making, grinding out victories rather than creating them. Their 1991 French Open 4th round match epitomized the generation gap. Chang, just 19 and already a French Open champion, outlasted the aging McEnroe in 5 sets. McEnroe's creativity couldn't overcome Chang's consistency and court coverage. The defeat stung not because Chang was superior in talent, McEnroe never believed that, but because it proved the game had moved on. The serve and volley era was dying, the athletic baseline game was taking over. McEnroe's frustration with Chang wasn't personal like it was with Connors or Lendl, it was existential. Chang was simply doing what worked in modern tennis. But that made it worse. The sport McEnroe loved was disappearing. These rivalries defined McEnroe as much as his victories did. Each opponent represented something he couldn't accept. Each match was a battle for tennis's soul, at least in his mind. Connors challenged his ego and proved toughness mattered as much as talent. Lendl broke his confidence and showed discipline could beat artistry. Wilander bored him and demonstrated patience wins championships. Nastase reflected his worst impulses and complicated his legacy. Gilbert mocked everything he believed tennis should be and succeeded anyway. Borg abandoned him and left a void nothing could fill. Chang proved the future had arrived without him. But these rivalries also made McEnroe legendary. His passion, his anger, his refusal to accept any version of tennis that didn't match his vision. That's why we still talk about him. McEnroe didn't just play tennis. He fought for what he thought the sport should be. Every tantrum had purpose. Every argument had principle. He wasn't just defending line calls, he was defending his vision of tennis as an art form, not a war of attrition. His opponents saw it differently. To them, McEnroe was just another competitor making excuses when things didn't go his way. But that fundamental disagreement made their matches unforgettable. The beauty of McEnroe's rivalries is that both perspectives were valid. Tennis needed McEnroe's artistry and passion. It also needed Lendl's discipline, Wilander's intelligence, and Gilbert's craftiness. The sport was big enough for all of them. McEnroe just never quite accepted that. And love him or hate him, nobody ever made tennis feel more electric. When McEnroe walked onto a court, something was about to happen. A brilliant winner, a volcanic eruption, a moment of pure genius or pure chaos, often both. His enemies on court became the foils that defined his career. Without them pushing back against his vision, his passion might have burned less bright. They didn't just beat him, they shaped him. And in doing so, they helped create the most compelling, complicated, and unforgettable player tennis has ever seen.